The grand exit and the empty pages. How do you tell the world you've spent 30 years polishing a masterpiece, only for the man who signed it to declare the canvas blank? How do you reconcile a lifetime of loyalty with a punch to the gut delivered in the hushed tones of a man discussing quarterly earnings? And tell me, honestly, when does a woman stop being a wife and start becoming a verdict? Welcome back to the channel, folks. You know I don't usually start with this kind of raw fire, but today, we're not just dissecting a story, we're witnessing a resurrection. Hit that subscribe button because what I'm about to share isn't just a memoir, it's a playbook. It's the truth behind the headlines they called The Scandal of Century Park. He wanted the divorce to be a surgical procedure, clean, quick, and leaving me with nothing but the scar tissue. It was a Tuesday. I remember the light. A cold, unforgiving winter glare slicing through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the sunroom, illuminating the dust motes dancing over the priceless Persian rug. Richard, my husband, the man who had shared my bed and my life for 3 decades, didn't even look up from the leather-bound settlement papers as he delivered the line that vaporized my existence. "Evelyn," he said, his voice a low, bored rumble. "We've had a good run. But the house, the collection, the company, they require a mind with a certain aptitude. And frankly, darling, you simply don't have it. You simply don't have it." The words weren't a revelation. They were the final, satisfying click of a lock he'd been tightening for years. The subtext screamed louder than any shout. "You are decoration, a convenience, disposable." I sat in the wrought iron chair, a $15,000 piece of furniture he'd once mocked me for selecting, and I felt nothing. It was the terrifying absence of emotion when you should be tearing down the walls. He was dismissing the woman who'd ghost-edited his speeches, managed his sprawling calendar, and raised a family, all while simultaneously acting as the silent, unseen curator of the very art collection he now used to define my aptitude. He pushed a sheaf of documents across the mahogany table. The lawyers were generous. A reasonable lump sum, the sedan, and a few boxes of your keepsakes. "Sign it, Evelyn. Don't make this difficult. Don't be hysterical. It's best for everyone." The sheer, arrogant entitlement. He knew I'd been out of the corporate world for 30 years. He knew the mental conditioning, the gaslighting, that had eroded my confidence, the constant, subtle suggestions that I was financially inept, emotionally fragile. He had manufactured my helplessness, and now he was demanding I sign the certificate of my own intellectual death. My eyes drifted past the papers to the 2 figures waiting stiffly by the entrance to the living room. His lawyer, a shark named Harrison, and the new model, Tiffany, barely 30, whose only discernible talent, as far as I could tell, was wearing Richard's newly purchased emeralds. Tiffany gave me a pitying, tight little smile, a gesture of pure, unadulterated triumph. And that was the true turning point. Not Richard's words, but Tiffany's smile. It was the visual confirmation of the moral rot, the sickening tableau of 2 people waiting for the final, humiliating capitulation of a third. My gaze snapped back to the signature line. Evelyn Grace Hawthorne. The name I had built, cherished, and now, I realized with a terrifying clarity, was about to become a historical footnote in his new life. He tapped the pen. "Now, Evelyn, we have a board meeting." I picked up the pen. It was heavy, a platinum Mont Blanc, a gift he'd given me on our 10th anniversary, the last gift with any genuine sentiment before our marriage became a series of transactions. I felt the familiar weight in my hand, but this time the weight felt less like an object and more like a weapon. My internal monologue was a storm in a teacup. "Sign it, Evelyn. Get the money. Retreat. Live. Survive." But another voice, one I hadn't heard since I gave up my career as an art consultant 2 decades ago, whispered back, "He wants you to sign the empty pages. He wants the easy out. He wants you to validate his contempt." I didn't sign. I didn't speak. I didn't cry. I looked up, meeting his eyes, those cold, calculating blue eyes that once promised me the world, and I saw something flicker there. Not love, not pity, but genuine, confused annoyance. The silence stretched, a taut, dangerous wire of unspoken conflict. "Richard," I finally said, my voice low, steady, and utterly unrecognizable to myself. "You want me to sign? Fine." I pushed the sheaf of papers back toward him, untouched. Then I stood up. My movement was slow, deliberate. I walked past him, past the shocked Harrison, past the smirking Tiffany. My silence was the loudest statement I had ever made. I walked through the house, my house, the house I had turned from a shell into a home, and I let the silence speak for the memory of the children's laughter in the hall, the quiet dinners by the fire, the ghosts of a life that was now nothing more than a carefully curated lie. I took 3 boxes, one filled with old family photo albums, one with my grandmother's china tea set, and the last one, tucked deep inside a pile of scarves, was the heavy leather-bound volume, my meticulous notes on the global art market from 1985 to 1995. The knowledge he had deemed worthless. As the cab pulled away from the stone gates of the 5-acre estate, I looked back at the house, a monument to his avarice and my naive faith. He thought he was tossing me into the gutter. He thought the game was over. He's wrong. He had thrown a pawn off the board, but what he hadn't realized was that the pawn was carrying the blueprints to the entire kingdom. He wanted an end. He was about to get a beginning. The settlement. Papers remained unsigned. I didn't get the money. I got the freedom to fight him with the only currency he truly valued: absolute, brutal competence. Richard thought he'd evicted a wife. He'd just unleashed an investigator. And the one thing a true collector never forgives is an amateur mistake, like underestimating the quiet woman who kept all the receipts. They say revenge is a dish best served cold. They're wrong. Revenge is a dish best served legal, and it requires months of simmering, not a quick microwave blast of emotion. You have to understand the law better than your adversary understands his own arrogance. The first few weeks were a descent into a gray anonymity I hadn't known since college. Richard, the master manipulator, had made sure my temporary housing was a pathetic joke. A soulless corporate rental suite on the outskirts of Greenwich, a place where the wallpaper peeled with apathy and the silence wasn't restful but deafening. It was the antithesis of the 50-year-old stone mansion, the home that smelled of wood smoke, old leather, and my own careful order. He wanted me to break, to call, to beg for a better settlement. He was waiting for the hysteria he'd trained me to feel. But the hysteria never came. It was replaced by something far colder: calculation. You see, for 30 years I'd been Evelyn Hawthorne, Richard's wife, the competent homemaker, the elegant hostess, the woman who had traded a sharp mind for a comfortable life. Now, stripped of the title, the house, and the security, I was forced to remember the person I had been before Richard's condescension calcified my ambition: Evelyn Grace, the art consultant, the one with an eye for forgery and a deep, deep understanding of where the world's dirty money went to hide. The contrast between the old life and the new was my fuel. I'd walk into the sad little kitchen, look at the mismatched crockery, and remember the custom-made Le Cornu stove in my former home. The one Richard had implied was the height of my capability. That deep irony didn't sting, it focused me. The loss wasn't about the things, it was about the contempt. And contempt demands interest, compounded daily. Richard's lawyer, Harrison, delivered the first real blow, the paperwork designed to crush my already compromised will. The proposed settlement offered me barely enough to cover my monthly expenses in this drab apartment, let alone rebuild a life. Harrison's letter dripped with smug professionalism, reminding me of Richard's generosity and hinting darkly that if I prolonged the process, my mental stability might become a factor in court. The nerve. He was playing the hand Richard dealt, paint the victim as the madwoman. I crumpled the letter, not in rage, but in contempt of my own. That night, I pulled out the third box, the one with the scarves. Beneath the silk and wool was the Chekhov's gun, my leather-bound portfolio. Inside were thousands of handwritten notes, analyses of major art purchases globally, and, most importantly, the meticulous, if unofficial, records of Richard's own burgeoning collection, begun in the early 2000s. I knew his taste for the extravagant, but I also knew his taste for the cheap shortcut. He loved the look of legitimacy without the price tag of ethics. I started making calls, using old contacts with names and numbers I'd deliberately kept secret, coded in my own private language in that journal. Not for divorce lawyers. I needed a predator, someone who understood how to hunt financial crimes. That's how I found Anna Karras. Anna wasn't a family law specialist. She was a criminal defense attorney with a notorious reputation for knowing exactly which lines to draw in the sand and which lines to cross. Our first meeting was in a dimly lit, anonymous office in Manhattan. I watched her across the scarred oak desk. She didn't offer sympathy. She offered efficiency. "Mrs. Hawthorne," she said, her voice gravelly, "Harrison's offer is an insult, but fighting Richard on marital grounds will take 5 years and bleed you dry. He has the better team and the deeper pockets." I leaned forward, the ghost of Evelyn Grace, the one who could spot a fake Basquiat from 20 feet, finally taking over the body of Evelyn Hawthorne. "You're right, Anna. I don't want 5 years. I don't want a percentage of his legitimate assets. I want justice, not for the hurt feelings, but for the crimes." I slid the heavy leather portfolio across the desk. Richard is a collector of status symbols. He buys the best lawyers, the best cars, and the best art. But lately, I suspect he's been cutting corners on the last one. And when you cut corners on a multi-million-dollar masterpiece, you start crossing lines with the IRS. Anna didn't scoff or dismiss me. She merely flipped open the book, her eyes scanning the meticulous notes detailing provenance, auction prices, and my own brief, damning observations about a particular acquisition 2 years ago. "The texture is too clean. The dating looks suspect. Likely a high-quality reproduction sourced through Singapore." "You're not asking me to fight the divorce, Evelyn," Anna murmured, a slow, predatory smile spreading across her face. "You're asking me to burn the foundation." "He built the house on quicksand," I countered, my voice steady. "He told me I wasn't smart enough to handle his money. He dismissed me as a simple housewife. But while he was making the deals, I was in the background, watching who he met, what he paid, and more importantly, why he refused to let any outside expert ever verify the actual collection. I know where the bodies are buried, Anna, and one of them is wrapped in a forged canvas." The game instantly changed. It stopped being about alimony and assets. It became about fraud, money laundering, and federal violations. The stakes went from losing my dignity to Richard losing his freedom. This wasn't revenge. It was an activation of the law, a clean surgical strike. We hired the best private investigator money could buy, a silent, efficient man named Marcus who specialized not in domestic snooping, but in tracing international finance flows. I handed him my notes, and he simply nodded, recognizing the code. Richard thought he was dealing with a victim seeking a payout. He was, in fact, dealing with an expert who had just found a major tax fraud case disguised as a divorce. The pauper was gone. The predator was emerging. I looked out at the dreary parking lot of my temporary prison. The sun was setting, but the light was rising inside me. He had used the house as a weapon to humiliate me. I would use the IRS as a scalpel to dissect him. The true price of the divorce wasn't the millions he might eventually pay me. It was the years he would spend wondering what else his simple wife knew. Don't forget to follow the full story on Behind Closed Doors and click that notification bell. The walls are about to come down, and you won't want to miss the sound of the collapse. A good hunter doesn't just track the prey, she learns the rhythm of its heartbeat, the habits of its arrogance. Richard wasn't just my target. He was my final greatest research subject. And his biggest habit? Believing he was too big to fail, too clever to be traced. The first month of collaboration with Anna and Marcus felt less like a legal strategy and more like preparing for a high-stakes corporate espionage mission. I was the silent partner, the library of overlooked knowledge. Every piece of information I fed Marcus, a casual remark Richard had made years ago about a Swiss trust, a specific code word he used for certain overseas vendors, the precise date he had taken out a massive, suspiciously quick loan, was a single, unseen wire in the intricate net we were weaving. My temporary apartment became a war room. The dreary corporate beige of the walls was papered over with timelines, transaction logs, and printouts of corporate filings. Richard assumed I was probably spending my days cycling through despair and expensive spa treatments. Instead, I was deep in the labyrinth of his offshore holdings, learning the ugly truth about how the very wealth he used to dismiss me was being shielded from the government that protected him. The moral conflict was acute, yet swiftly resolved. Was it right to use the state, the IRS, the very institution I'd always dutifully paid, to destroy my husband? Absolutely. He hadn't just betrayed me. He had committed systemic fraud, believing his entitlement granted him immunity. My pursuit wasn't personal spite anymore. It was an act of civil responsibility disguised as the ultimate revenge. I wasn't just fighting for my half of the marital estate. I was fighting for the legitimacy of the system he had scorned. Marcus, the taciturn investigator, confirmed my suspicions about the art. Richard hadn't just overvalued his collection for insurance or status. He had, on several key occasions, used company funds to purchase high-grade reproductions from dubious European sources, classifying them as genuine assets in company ledgers to inflate his net worth, while simultaneously underreporting the transaction to avoid tax liability. This wasn't merely hiding money from a wife, this was tax evasion, a federal offense. He used the art as a double shield, Evelyn, Anna explained over a secure line. He could show off the masterpieces to his board, and if you ever questioned their value in a divorce, he'd dismiss you as the amateur. But he never considered that the amateur might have a 20-year background in authentication. The moment I heard that he'd used my passion, my former competence as a literal cover for his crime, a cold, satisfying resolve settled over me. He wanted me to be small and ignorant. I would use the expansive, sophisticated world he inhabited to bring him down. The true twist came when Marcus reported his findings on Richard's affair. Tiffany, the secretary, wasn't just a physical distraction. She was a complicit distraction. She had signed documents, handled certain wire transfers, and, crucially, was fully aware that Richard was using their trips to Europe to facilitate the art fraud. This knowledge could have been explosive in a traditional divorce, but I instructed Anna to keep it completely silent. "We don't go after the affair, Anna," I stated firmly. "That's cheap theater. We go after the money. We don't want Richard scrambling to settle the divorce. We want him blindsided by the government." We made the move. Anna, using my documented evidence of the questionable provenance and the hidden accounts, made an anonymous, highly detailed report to the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, CI. We didn't send a whiny divorce lawyer letter. We sent a perfectly packaged case file detailing felony tax fraud. The IRS, facing pressure to recover billions, doesn't ignore a file this clean and complete, especially when it involves someone of Richard's public stature. The waiting game began. It was a time of immense internal conflict, fought entirely within the confines of my mind. What if they don't pursue it? What if he finds out? What if I lose everything, including my peace? This internal monologue was intense. I found myself standing in front of the single small mirror in the apartment, looking for signs of weakness, searching for the old Evelyn. But all I saw was the quiet resolve of the new one. The former wife was gone. The strategist remained. Then, the first sign of success. Subtle, barely perceptible to anyone but a man consumed by paranoia. Richard missed a public board meeting. Unheard of. A small article appeared in a minor financial blog noting that his company had delayed its quarterly earnings report. The unseen wires were beginning to tighten. Anna called, her voice carefully neutral. Richard is spooked. He's called Harrison 3 times today asking about an unexpected audit. He's not thinking about the divorce, Evelyn. He's thinking about the feds. That was the sound of the game turning. He was no longer the smug CEO dictating terms. He was a trapped animal, glancing over his shoulder. He thought his biggest threat was a woman seeking a payout. He was completely unaware that I had weaponized the full weight of the U.S. government against him, not for a quick victory, but for a total, systemic annihilation. Richard made his final, predictable mistake. He called me. Evelyn. His voice was strained, the usual condescension replaced by a brittle edge. Let's talk. Forget Harrison, I can offer you better. The house in the Hamptons. A much more substantial lump sum. We can still settle this amicably. The word amicably was a poison dart wrapped in silk. He wasn't offering peace. He was offering a bribe to make a potential federal investigation disappear. I drew a deep breath. I imagined Tiffany standing nearby, her face pale. I imagined him alone in the mansion, the masterpieces staring back at him like silent accusers. Richard, I said, my voice sweet, low, and utterly devoid of emotion. I appreciate the offer, but I'm not interested in the Hamptons anymore. I'm not interested in your money. I'm interested in finality. I hung up before he could respond. He wanted to settle the divorce. I was settling his score with the state. The ultimate payoff wasn't financial. It was the ability to reject his bribe, to refuse his power, and to know that my justice was completely independent of his willingness to pay. I didn't want his money. I wanted his consequence. The IRS was the new lawyer, and the courtroom would soon become the stage. Panic is a fragile thing. When it grips a man accustomed to control, it strips away the polish, revealing the scared, calculating animal underneath. Richard thought he could buy his way out of anything. But you can't negotiate with a federal subpoena, and you certainly can't manipulate the tax code with a smirk. The phone call ended, and the silence in my tiny apartment was electric. I hadn't raised my voice, hadn't insulted him, hadn't even mentioned Tiffany. I simply denied him the quick escape, and that denial was 1,000 times more potent than any screaming match. Richard's offer, the Hamptons, the money, was the frantic plea of a man who suddenly realized the low-stakes game of marital maneuvering had escalated into a high-stakes federal investigation. He was caught in the classic trap of the arrogant, white-collar criminal. He had meticulously planned to defraud the government, but he hadn't planned for the collateral damage of a disgruntled, overlooked wife who understood his secrets better than his auditors. The moral ambiguity for me was long gone. His actions were criminal, and my response was simply the enforcement of the rule of law he believed he was above. The pressure mounted. Swiftly. Within a week, Marcus confirmed that Richard's corporate and personal accounts were under severe scrutiny. The IRS wasn't just auditing, they were circling. Richard's lawyer, Harrison, who had previously treated my demands with dismissive contempt, now sounded strained and almost frantic when he spoke to Anna. Mrs. Hawthorne's initial divorce petition is confusing, Harrison stammered to Anna during a tense conference call that I listened to in the background. Why the sudden interest in the provenance of the Asian collection? It's irrelevant to the marital estate division. Anna, a maestro of controlled composure, simply replied, "My client, Mr. Harrison, has a deep, personal interest in the integrity of American commerce." She merely noted some irregularities that she felt were ethically bound to report. It seems the IRS agreed with her ethical obligation. The sheer mirth of the moment was almost overwhelming. Richard had spent decades making me feel ethically and intellectually inferior, yet his own massive ethical blind spot, his greed, was now the weapon that would dismantle him. The art of opposing and sarcasm was thick in the air. He had wanted me gone, and now the state was making sure he had plenty of time alone. Richard tried one last desperate attempt at damage control directly with me. He didn't call, he showed up. One rainy evening, I opened the apartment door to find him standing there, his $1,000 coat soaked, his face a roadmap of exhaustion and fear. The usual tailored composure was gone, replaced by a desperate, sweaty sincerity that was utterly nauseating. "Evelyn, please," he whispered, pushing past the threshold, violating the sanctuary of my small, anonymous life. "We can fix this. This is ridiculous. It's an overreaction. Just call off your lawyers. Call off the IRS." The request itself was an admission of guilt. He wasn't pleading innocence. He was pleading for a pardon only I could grant. I stood there, utterly still, allowing the small, drafty apartment to contrast sharply with his imposing presence. The power of silence became my shield and my hammer. "Call them off?" I finally asked, my voice flat. "Richard, the Internal Revenue Service doesn't take calls from a former wife looking to call off a federal investigation. They operate on evidence." "But you gave them the evidence, the file, the details about the Singapore transaction, the art." He stopped, realizing he was verbally confessing the crime he was so desperately trying to hide. This was the midpoint climax, the moment he officially recognized my power. He offered a full, non-negotiable settlement, everything I had initially asked for, and more. A blank check. "I'll give you the house," he choked out. "The house. The entire trust. Just tell them you made a mistake. Say it was a spousal miscommunication." I looked at him, the man who had traded our life for a temporary affair and a fake painting. And I knew the true purpose of my revenge. It wasn't about the money. "Richard, you keep offering me money to solve a moral problem," I explained, leaning against the kitchen counter, adopting the clinical tone I used to use when negotiating multi-million-dollar deals. "The house? It's a liability to you now. The money? It's tainted by your greed. I don't want your cash. I want consequence." "Consequence?" he sneered, the fear momentarily replaced by his old, familiar cruelty. "You'll get nothing, Evelyn. They'll drag this through the mud, they'll bury you in legal fees, and you'll walk away with less than I first offered. You think you're smart? You're being stupid." His rage was my final confirmation. The last shreds of the mask were gone. "Perhaps," I conceded, a subtle smile touching my lips. "But here's the difference, Richard. I'm not playing the divorce game anymore. You are. And I'm not the one the government is currently investigating. You are." "I am not making this about revenge," I lied beautifully. "I am making this about justice, and justice, unlike the art you bought, is not for sale." I opened the door and gestured out into the rain. "You need to leave, Richard. You're trespassing, and you should call your lawyer. Tell him to prepare for the inevitable, because this isn't ending in a settlement, it's ending in an indictment." As he staggered out into the night, defeated and exposed. I didn't feel triumph. I felt a cold, deep catharsis. I hadn't succumbed to his manipulation. I hadn't accepted the bribe. I had stood on the moral high ground he had forced me to abandon and watched him sink into the quicksand of his own making. The money meant nothing. The rejection of his power meant everything. I had made him realize that the one asset he never insured against, my specialized knowledge and silent resilience, was the one asset that would cost him everything. The stage was set. The investigation was irreversible. Now, all I had to do was send the invitation. A beautiful invitation is an elegant form of aggression. It promises celebration, but delivers expectation. For a narcissist like Richard, the ultimate hook isn't money or sex. It's the chance to walk back into the scene of his perceived triumph and deliver one final, crushing blow. He accepted the invitation because he couldn't imagine a world where I was setting the stage. Richard left my apartment that night a broken man, but the breaking hadn't finished. The IRS was doing its meticulous paper-shuffling work, freezing accounts, issuing subpoenas, and generally creating the financial equivalent of a full-scale earthquake under his corporate empire. He was spending his days battling the implacable machinery of the state, distracted, paranoid, and utterly drained. He still believed, in the back of his mind, that I was a manageable nuisance, a spurned ex-wife who could be appeased or outmaneuvered if he just got his federal troubles sorted first. That was his fatal error, underestimation. It was time to bring him back to the place of his greatest arrogance, the house. I worked with Anna and Marcus to time the final confrontation perfectly. We needed the federal investigation to be at its apex, the point just before an official arrest warrant or indictment drops. But before Richard fully understood the totality of the evidence I had provided. His guard had to be up enough to be wary, but down enough to be smug. The invitation itself was a masterpiece of passive aggression and refined cruelty. I designed it myself, printed on heavy cream stock with gold filigree, the kind of stationery he always insisted upon, the kind that whispered of old money and untouchable status. The text was simple, elegant, and devastating. You are cordially invited to attend a private gathering at 1480 Century Park Drive, marking the formal and final conclusion of the matter between Richard Hawthorne and Evelyn Grace, Friday, 7 p.m. Promptness is appreciated. Documentation will be exchanged. Dress, ceremonial. The implication was clear. I was ready to sign the final papers, to accept my fate, and perhaps to do so with some semblance of grace and closure. The location, 1480 Century Park Drive, was the bait. That was his address, the monument to his success, the place from which he had expelled me with such heartless disdain. And I made sure to include a small typed enclosure card addressed specifically to Tiffany. I look forward to meeting you again under different circumstances. I sent the invitations via a prestigious courier service, ensuring they landed on his desk while he was grappling with a particularly nasty subpoena. Richard called Anna immediately, his voice ringing with a fresh wave of suspicion. "What is this, Anna? A trap? Why the house?" Anna played her role beautifully, delivering the professional lie. "Mr. Hawthorne, Mrs. Grace simply believes that for the final, amicable dissolution of a 30-year marriage, the exchange of documents should occur in the place where the commitment began. It provides a clean, symbolic break. And frankly, she still has a few personal items, non-marital property, to retrieve. It's practical, not punitive. Practical. That's the word that got him. Richard's mind was so consumed by the financial and legal vortex that he latched onto the practical explanation. He convinced himself that I was desperate to end the investigation, and this was my final act of surrender disguised as dignity. He saw the invitation not as a final chessboard move, but as a chance for him and Tiffany to parade their victory in the living room I had decorated. His ego demanded that closing ceremony. During the week leading up to the party, I returned to the house. It felt strange, like visiting the mausoleum of my past self. Anna had arranged for temporary access under the guise of an inventory check. I wasn't there to pack. I was there to redecorate. I had the staff. The same, loyal staff Richard assumed were still his, carefully rearranged the sunroom where he had tried to humiliate me. The mahogany table was removed, replaced by a simple antique writing desk I'd inherited from my grandmother. A desk that meant nothing to Richard but symbolized my own independent history. On it, I placed two sealed envelopes, one marked Settlement Agreement and the other, significantly heavier, marked Confiscation Order. The final touch was the art. I walked through the massive living room, pausing before the masterpieces, the fake Rothko, the suspiciously cheap bronze Degas copy. I didn't touch them. I simply had the lighting adjusted, subtly, to expose the poor quality of the canvas and the cheap varnish. Only someone with my expertise would notice, but the poor quality would subtly undermine the confidence of anyone who knew what to look for. I chose my outfit, not the typical, demure black dress of a woman in mourning. I chose a dress the color of deep emerald, cut sharply, tailored to perfection. A color he hated, a style he'd deemed too ambitious for a housewife. The kind of gown a woman wears when she's not begging for a handout, but walking to the throne. The afternoon of the party, I stood on the grand staircase looking down at the empty marble floor. This was the moment of dramatic narrative and moral dichotomy. Below me, I could almost see Richard and Tiffany, ready to sneer and sign and be done. They represented the sin, greed, betrayal, and contempt. I was the manifestation of the inevitable consequence: justice, patience, and competence. I wasn't just preparing to confront them. I was staging an intervention of cosmic proportions, using the very objects and spaces he cherished as silent witnesses against him. The house, the place he had used to define my insignificance, was about to be officially reclaimed as the venue for his professional demise. I sent a final short text to Marcus and Anna. The Queen is ready for the gambit, 7 p.m. He had thrown a party for his triumph when he kicked me out. I was throwing a party for my freedom, and the guest of honor didn't know he was the main course. This wasn't just a divorce. It was an eviction notice delivered by the state, with the key handover scheduled to happen in the enemy's own living room. If you're still with me, you know the drill. Hit that like button and make sure you've subscribed to Behind Closed Doors. The curtain is about to rise on the final spectacular scene, and trust me, you won't want to miss the grand entrance. In the theater of revenge, the villain must always arrive on time. Punctuality is the courtesy demanded of the condemned. Richard, ever the stickler for a schedule, drove right into the closing act of his own downfall, utterly convinced he was the leading man. The clock on the mantelpiece in the living room, the antique French clock I insisted Richard buy because of its provenance, chimed precisely 7 times. The sound resonated through the meticulously quiet house, a crisp final note before the storm. I was waiting, not downstairs with the settlement papers, but halfway up the grand staircase. It was a calculated visual effect, forcing them to look up, to acknowledge that I was physically, visually, above them. The front door opened with its familiar, heavy sigh. Richard strode in first, not like a defeated man, but like a weary victor finally returning to claim his spoils. He had the stiff, aggressive posture of a CEO who'd been dealing with irritating paperwork all day. Beside him, Tiffany, dripping in a new, inappropriate cocktail dress and the emerald necklace he'd bought her, radiated a toxic mix of excitement and disdain. She immediately scanned the room, not for me, but for the art. the validation of her new status. Their dialogue was immediate and gratingly predictable, a script I had played out in my mind 1,000 times. God, it smells the same, Tiffany drawled, her voice echoing in the marble foyer. Like potpourri and old money. We're redoing the entryway entirely, Richard. Less Evelyn. Richard gave a dismissive wave toward the sunroom, where the antique desk stood waiting. Just sign the papers, Tiffany. Let's get this done. I need to be back in the city to deal with this bloody audit. He emphasized the word audit, a coded message to Tiffany that his real troubles were technical, not moral. They walked toward the sunroom, and I let them pass, savoring the moment of their blissful ignorance. Richard stopped short, noticing the small, humble desk replacing the massive mahogany table. His face tightened with professional annoyance. "What is this?" he muttered, scowling. "Where are the proper documents? And where is Harrison?" I explicitly told him this needed to be handled with efficiency, not sentimentality. Tiffany spotted the 2 envelopes on the desk. One was clearly marked settlement. The other was the one I carefully weighted with official-looking paper. Confiscation. "Oh, look, Rich!" she chirped, picking up the lighter envelope with a manicured hand. "She's finally folding, thank God. Let's just sign it and get out of this mausoleum." That was my cue. I didn't sweep down the stairs. I simply started to descend, slowly, each step measured, the emerald dress catching the light from the massive chandelier. The sound of my heels on the marble was the only thing that interrupted Tiffany's chatter. They both froze. Richard, initially annoyed, quickly adopted his mask of condescending patience. Tiffany's smile dissolved into a tight, hateful line. "Evelyn," Richard said, his tone dripping with the forced civility he used with junior partners. "Good of you to finally join us. We were just about to finalize this. You've had your little moment in the sun. Now let's stop wasting everyone's time. Sign the documents." I paused on the second-to-last step, allowing myself to meet his eyes. Cold, hard, and utterly confident in his belief that he still held all the cards. This was the confrontation, the moment of raw, concentrated power. "Sign the documents, Richard?" I asked, my voice resonating with a calm that chilled even my own blood. It wasn't the voice of the wronged wife. It was the voice of a judge delivering a sentence. "You seem to misunderstand the purpose of this gathering." Tiffany huffed, crossing her arms. "The purpose is to sign the divorce papers so Richard can finally sell this dreary place and we can move on. Stop being so dramatic, Evelyn." I ignored her completely. My eyes remained fixed on Richard, employing the technique of the power of silence until his professional facade began to crack. "The purpose of this gathering, Richard," I continued, finally stepping onto the main floor, closing the gap between us, "is to correct the record. You came into this house 6 months ago and told me I was incompetent, that I had no aptitude for finance or business, and that I was worthless outside of maintaining your facade." "Evelyn, this is irrelevant melodrama," Richard snapped, his fear starting to bleed through the anger. "Sign the paper. I'll instruct Harrison to double the lump sum. Just sign the damn paper." He was offering a desperate, last-minute bribe, confirming my rejection of him earlier that week was the correct move. "No, Richard," I said softly, picking up the smaller, lighter envelope, the one Tiffany had examined. "I won't be signing this document." I didn't tear it. I placed it back on the desk with a quiet finality. "This is a document granting your freedom, and I have decided you don't deserve it." His face flushed crimson. "You foolish woman. You'll get nothing then. You'll bankrupt yourself." "Ah, but I believe you are the one facing bankruptcy, darling," I countered, the sarcasm sharp and deliberate. I picked up the second, heavier envelope. "You see, Richard, while you were busy trying to humiliate me with your lawyer, I was busy hiring mine. Not a family lawyer to debate who gets the silver, but a criminal defense lawyer. and a forensic investigator. The color drained from Richard's face. Tiffany's hand flew to her mouth. They realized the audit was no accident. "You think this is about Tiffany?" I continued, dismissing his infidelity with the wave of my hand, an act of supreme psychological cruelty. "Please, that's tabloid fodder. This is about your arrogance, Richard. It's about the fact that you thought you could use corporate funds to buy cheap, fake art in Europe, declare it genuine, inflate its value for your books, and then quietly hide the capital to defraud the IRS. You didn't just lie to me, you lied to the federal government." I didn't wait for his reply. I tore open the heavy envelope and pulled out the crisp official document. This wasn't a divorce petition. "You called me worthless," I concluded, holding the document aloft, allowing them both to see the unmistakable seals and official script. "But my knowledge, my aptitude, was enough to expose your decade of fraud. Richard, I'm not here to sign the divorce papers. I'm here because as of 7:00 p.m. tonight, the IRS, having found probable cause for massive tax evasion, has issued a warrant for emergency confiscation of assets. And that includes this house, Richard. They haven't arrested you yet, but they have officially seized your property, and I'm just here to deliver the paperwork." There is a silence that follows the delivery of an unappealable verdict, a silence heavier than any scream, a vacuum where a lifetime of lies suddenly implodes. That was the sound that filled my living room when Richard realized the game was over. And I wasn't just his opponent. I was the executioner. Richard's face, usually so commanding, crumpled into an expression of sheer, agonizing disbelief. It was the face of a man who, having climbed to the top of the financial world, had just been pushed off by the very thing he considered insignificant. Tiffany merely shrieked, a high-pitched, pathetic sound that finally broke the silence. "Confiscation? Evelyn, you can't. This is my house. You have no standing. This is a trick." Richard lunged forward, not at me, but at the document in my hand, as if destroying the paper would somehow negate the federal power it represented. I took a precise step back, keeping the signed order safe. "No, Richard, this isn't a trick. This is the law. And for the last 6 months, your legal aptitude has been so focused on cheating me out of alimony that you completely ignored the gaping hole in your federal compliance. You were so busy insulting my intelligence that you never once thought about the possibility that my former life, the life you forced me to give up, equipped me with the exact knowledge needed to spot your high-grade international tax fraud." I gestured around the living room, letting my eyes linger on his prized possessions. "You remember the acquisition from Singapore, Richard? The one you used company capital to purchase, classifying it as a genuine early abstract expressionist piece, grossly inflating the value to dodge millions in taxes?" "I remember. And the IRS now knows too." He stammered, his eyes darting to Tiffany, who was now clutching her arms, looking for an exit, not an explanation. "It was a legitimate purchase. Harrison handled all the paperwork." "Harrison handled the paperwork for the divorce, Richard. He didn't handle the evidence I provided to the IRS that confirms the purchase was fraudulent," I countered, the calmness of my voice utterly devastating. "That masterpiece over there?" I pointed to a large, vibrant canvas he had been particularly proud of. "It's a very expensive fake. I knew it the moment you bought it, and yes, I provided the IRS with the exact records, the real provenance, and the names of the overseas shell corporations you used to run the dirty money. Your greed made you complacent, and your complacency made you predictable." This was the final, devastating twist. He was being undone not by a random government audit, but by the one person he deemed too unintelligent to manage a checkbook. Just as the scene reached its emotional peak, the front door opened again, this time quietly and efficiently. 2 figures in dark, serious suits entered, moving with an air of professional authority that chilled the blood. Marcus, my private investigator, was standing just inside, confirming their presence. These weren't Richard's lawyers, they were federal agents. The lead agent, a woman with steel gray hair and an unwavering gaze, walked straight to Richard, bypassing me completely. This was the moment the personal revenge became legitimate, external justice. Mr. Richard Hawthorne, I am Agent Ramirez of the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. We have reason to believe that you have engaged in repeated acts of tax evasion and misuse of corporate funds. You are required to accompany us downtown for questioning immediately. Furthermore, under the authority of this court order, she nodded toward the document I held. This property and all liquid assets tied to the holding corporation are hereby placed under immediate federal seizure. The sound of the agent's words hit Richard like a physical blow. He didn't collapse, but he aged 20 years in 20 seconds. This is outrageous. I demand to see my lawyer, he roared, the last vestige of his executive power dissolving into impotent fury. Agent Ramirez was unmoved. You will be provided access to counsel upon arrival at the station, sir. For now, you are merely required to comply. And then came the moment that was worth every single sleepless night in that dreary corporate apartment, every penny spent on the legal team, and every memory of his past condescension. Richard turned to look at Tiffany, the woman he'd sacrificed his family and reputation for. Tiffany didn't offer sympathy or loyalty. She looked at the federal agents, looked at the house suddenly under seizure, and looked at Richard, stripped of his power and his property. She snatched the emerald necklace from her throat, threw it onto the marble floor where it clattered harmlessly, and backed away, her high heels clicking frantically toward the door. I didn't know anything about the taxes, she screamed, her voice cracking with fear and self-preservation. He never told me. I'm leaving. I'm calling a cab. She was gone, running out into the dark night, leaving Richard utterly alone, betrayed by his mistress, abandoned by his possessions, and defeated by the wife he had mocked. Richard stared at the front door where Tiffany had vanished, then back at me, the emerald dress reflecting the light. The confiscation order held like a royal decree. The look in his eyes wasn't rage, it was a deep, terrible realization. You, he choked out, his voice hoarse. You planned this. You didn't want the money. You wanted all of it. I wanted justice, Richard. I corrected him, my voice cool. And I wanted you to understand that you kicked me out of your house, but you never kicked me out of your secrets. Now, if you'll excuse me, these agents have business to attend to, and I need to finalize the paperwork that declares this house federal property. The federal agents took Richard's arms. He didn't resist. He was paralyzed by the psychological defeat. As they led him across the marble floor, the floor he had mocked me for choosing, he looked back one last time. He saw the cold, efficient agents, the quiet certainty of the law, and the woman he had dismissed, standing strong and utterly triumphant in the very center of the home he had just lost. The final, ironic touch? He was being led away for crimes related to property by the woman he had deemed too ignorant to possess any. The show is officially over, but the final, satisfying conclusion is yet to be told. Don't go anywhere. Subscribe to Behind Closed Doors and hit that bell. You won't want to miss the epilogue to the scandal. They say the best revenge is living well, but I learned something deeper. The best revenge is living legally and transforming the instruments of your oppression into the pillars of your freedom. The house was once his cage for me. Now it became the foundation for my second act. 6 months. That's how long it took for the storm to subside and the dust to truly settle. 6 months for the federal courts to process Richard Hawthorne's plea deal, a plea he took to avoid decades behind bars, settling instead for a significantly shorter sentence and the complete, utter forfeiture of nearly everything he owned. The financial empire he had built on fraud and sustained with arrogance crumbled, not in a dramatic corporate failure, but through the relentless, paper-shuffling efficiency of the IRS. The press had a field day. The scandal of Century Park became a case study in white-collar greed and spousal betrayal. Richard, the titan of industry, was reduced to a cautionary tale on the nightly news. Tiffany, true to form, disappeared entirely, her brief moment of fame ending with a hysterical retreat from a federal seizure. And me? I found myself paradoxically the unlikely owner of the magnificent stone mansion at 1480 Century Park Drive. This wasn't some legal loophole I exploited for profit. The house was federal property for a brief, tense period. But thanks to Anna's brilliant legal maneuvering, which focused not on claiming the property as a marital asset but on establishing my continuous legal right to reside there, and the fact that the fraud was exclusively Richard's corporate crime, I was able to negotiate with the IRS. I leveraged the full value of the legitimate marital estate I was owed, plus a significant portion of the reward the government gives whistleblowers for reporting massive tax fraud, to purchase the house, back from the government at a highly favorable rate. The ultimate delicious irony: Richard's crimes funded my ownership. The first thing I did after the transfer was official wasn't to throw a party, but to take a long, silent walk through every room. The house no longer smelled of Richard's ambition and my quiet compliance. It smelled of fresh air and possibility. I didn't change the structure, but I changed the purpose. I kept the beautiful library and the sprawling sunroom, but the collection of fake art, the central instrument of his fraud, was gone, seized and donated to an art forensics program for study in forgery detection. I wasn't keeping the house for status. I was keeping it for meaning. I established the Grace Foundation within those walls, a nonprofit organization dedicated to providing financial and legal mentorship to women leaving financially abusive marriages. The foundation's initial capital? The remaining cash settlement I received from the forfeiture reward. My goal wasn't just to help women survive, it was to teach them how to fight legally, how to use the system against the manipulators. I was turning my traumatic experience into a tactical manual for others. I remembered Richard's words from our last encounter in my tiny apartment. "You'll get nothing, Evelyn. You'll bankrupt yourself." He had been wrong on every count. The moral dichotomy was never clearer. Richard had chased material gain through moral decay. I had chased justice and found material security as a byproduct of ethical action. The house, once a monument to his avarice, was now a sanctuary for female competence and resilience. 6 months after the arrest, I threw the divorce party I had promised. It wasn't a party for revenge, but for celebration. The guest list was comprised of Anna, Marcus, the dedicated staff who had stayed loyal to me, and all the initial inspiring members of the Grace Foundation. The air was thick with genuine laughter and the sound of hope, a sound Richard had banished for years. The climax of my healing, however, was private. One afternoon, a letter arrived, forwarded from Anna's office. It was a formal notification from the Federal Bureau of Prisons detailing Richard's current placement and status. He was no longer a CEO, he was an inmate number. I sat at the old antique desk in the sunroom, the desk that represented my independence, and looked out over the massive, manicured lawn that was now legally, unequivocally mine. I took a photo of the party, a wide shot showing dozens of women laughing, raising glasses in the foyer, framed by the grand staircase. I didn't send him a letter of spite. I didn't send him a philosophical quote. I simply mailed Richard a pristine, custom-made card, the same heavy cream stock as the invitation to the divorce party. Inside, I tucked the photograph of the successful launch of the Grace Foundation, taken in his former living room. Below the photo, I wrote 2 short sentences. "Thank you, Richard. You gave me the opportunity to become myself. Evelyn." I didn't need him to understand the layers of sarcasm or the profound irony. I just needed him to know that the woman he had tried to erase was not only surviving but thriving, using his downfall as the catalyst for her greatest achievement. His punishment wasn't just prison time, it was the knowledge that the house, the ultimate symbol of his power, was now a beacon for the exact kind of women he had always sought to crush. The house always wins, I realized, and in the end, it was my side that held the key. And that, my friends, is how a pawn uses a federal subpoena to checkmate the queen and claim the entire board. Thank you for listening to my story on Behind Closed Doors. Now, what secrets are you holding on to that could change your game? Don't forget to like and subscribe for more confessions that prove the truth is always more twisted than fiction.